Once upon a time, a man had 2 sons. The youngest son one day went up to his dad and said, "Dad, I wish you were dead. I would like my share of the inheritance right now." The father gave him the money. The boy went off to a far country, burned through all of it, wound up in a pig pen, wondering, how in the world did my life come to this? So he went home with his head hung low, longing to be accepted back at his father's house. Maybe Dad will take me back just as a slave. Maybe I can serve at his table. When his father went out to meet him, the father quite rightly looked at his son and said, "Boy, how dare you come home after all you've done? You're dead to me." Is that what happens in the story? No. He says, "Son, you sinned greatly. You got what you deserved. But since I'm your father, I tell you what I'll do. I'm full of grace. I will let you come home as the lowest servant. I will allow you to wash my feet." Is that what he says? No. He says, "Son, you can come home, and maybe one day you can be fully accepted as a son, but for now, you're going to be on a trial period. Okay, we'll let you come home. We'll watch you for a while, watch you for a couple years, make sure your repentance is genuine, and then maybe after that trial period of time, I will accept you back as a full son." Is that what happens? No. Okay, what happens is the grace of the Father is so abounding, it's so irrational that the Father sees his son from a long way off. He runs, he embraces him, he gives kisses to him, he gives gifts, lavish gifts. He restores him to a full status as a loved son. He even goes so far that he kills the fatted calf to throw a party for this son who is lost and is found. He was dead, but now he is alive. And as I read Luke chapter 15, that's the character I want to be, right? I want to be the son who has all his sins forgiven. I want to be the son who's presented with these lavish gifts. I want to be the one who gets a party thrown in my honor. I read Luke 15 and think, wouldn't it be great to be this prodigal son sitting in his father's house enjoying the party? But the father in our story had 2 sons. And before I identify too strongly as the prodigal, I need to seriously ask myself a hard question. Am I not really more like the older brother? Okay, I'm afraid as I read this story, that's who I should be identifying with, and it's probable that I'm not the only one. Okay, so join our story in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 25. The party is going on. The younger son is being honored. Everyone is amazed at the celebration that's going on. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. You never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes come home, you kill the fatted calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always welcome with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." All right, one of the things that would jump out to the first hearers of this parable is Jesus stands in a crowded room and tells this story. The first thing that would strike everybody as just wrong is the way that the father acts. Okay, last week we talked about how culturally offensive it would have been for the father to see the younger son coming down the road and run out to meet him. Fathers aren't supposed to do that. He should have just sat back, let the young son come to him. Okay, and notice this week, yet again, the father goes out to his son. This time he goes out to the older son. Again, he shouldn't have done this. Okay, according to social custom, the father doesn't leave a party that he is throwing. He is the host of the party. What he should have done is sent one of his servants out to go fetch the older brother. But the father wants more than anything to have his sons home with him celebrating. More than anything else, more than he cares about social customs or whatever, he wants his children to be home with him. The father deeply loves both his sons. Right? I'm assuming I don't have to spell out for you what that teaches us about God's love, do I? Okay, you and I are here this morning because we have a Father who desperately loves us, who desperately longs for us to be with him. But I read this story, and I have a lot of sympathy for the older brother. Okay, I am an older brother. I know what it's like to live with parents who, quite frankly, aren't fair. Any of you older siblings? Several of you are nodding already, okay? You know where I'm going with this, right? I think about when I was a teenager, I had a curfew. Right, and if I wanted to stay out later than curfew, I would go ask my parents for a special curfew dispensation. All right, say there's a party going on, there's something going on, I need to stay out later than the posted curfew, and they would tell me, no, you need to be home by curfew or else. Okay, and when my parents said or else, there was some teeth behind that, all right? They meant that. Okay, so as the dutiful son, what I did was I was home by curfew. I don't think there was a single time I was a teenager that I missed curfew because I knew what the consequences would be if I didn't get home by curfew. All right, my little sister is 2 years behind me, 2 grades behind me, and I remember after I went off to college, I came home one night, and it was after curfew, and I said, Mom, Dad, where's my little sister? Oh, she asked if she could stay out late. She had something she needed to do, so she'll be home later. Really? Good for her. I also remember that I went off to college, and when I was in college, I worked while I was in school. Right? If I wanted to go to the movies, if I wanted to put gas in my car, the way that I had money to do those things was I went to my bank account where my paychecks went, and I got the money that I earned at my job to pay for the things that I needed. Right? My parents taught me that's how the economy works. You want money to spend, you go earn money, and then you have money to spend. Okay, so from the time I was 16 years old, I had my bank account that I put my money in, and that's what I used for my things. Right? My little sister goes to college. First thing they do, they get her a credit card that mom and dad pay for. I asked them, why in the world does she get a credit card? And mom said, well, she has things that she needs. She needs to put gas in her car, and she needs to get stuff, and she needs da-da-da-da-da. Awesome. Of course she does. I'm over it, really, I promise. I tried my best growing up to help my parents raise her, and they kept turning down my free advice. She would have turned out much better if they'd let me have more of a hand in that. Okay, so back in Luke 15, here is our older brother from the story of the prodigal son. The older brother was responsible. He did what he was supposed to do. When his idiot younger brother comes wandering down the road, what's the older brother doing? He's working. He's in the field working like he's supposed to be doing. In fact, had his little brother not run off, led a completely selfish life, been sinful in every way imaginable, older brother wouldn't have had to work as hard because his younger brother should be out there working with him, right? By leaving home, the older brother had to work harder to cover over the incompetence of his little brother. You can't tell me that if that was you, you wouldn't be seriously upset with your idiot brother. And you can see how differently the father and the older brother view the second son just in the way they talk about him. Okay, notice in the text it says that the older son refers to this son of yours. And yet when the father repeats it back to him, he talks about this brother of yours. Just like when Luke does something especially praiseworthy, right? Like when he started reading at 2 years old, I talked about, that's my son. right? When he's shoving Sam face first down the slide at the playground, I say to Rachel, look at what your son is doing, right? That's what's going on in the story. So I sympathize with the older brother because if we truly, okay, and this is the point I want you to get this morning, if we truly understand the concept of grace, it's offensive. Okay? Grace is offensive. Grace isn't fair. In fact, grace seems to be condoning bad behavior. I mean, what kind of future does the younger brother have if he can just blow through a fortune and turn around and not face any consequences? You know, whenever I see kids misbehaving in a grocery store or whining for something, and then the mom turns around and gets the kid what they were whining for, I judge those parents. Okay? I know that they're teaching their kids that they can get away with doing whatever they want. Those kids are later going to grow up and need legal counsel, right? Aren't we supposed to hold people accountable for their actions? Shouldn't bad behavior have consequences? What kind of parent is this father anyways? And so with indignity, with a clear sense of righteous superiority, the brother stays outside while the party goes on inside. All right, if you were to sit down and one day read through all of Luke and Acts, you would clearly see that more than any other New Testament author, Luke really wants us to see the importance of eating with Jesus. Okay, one of the big questions that permeates the entire Gospel of Luke and carries on through Acts is who gets a seat at Jesus' banquet table? Okay, you notice one of the last stories from the Gospel of Luke is about two travelers on the road to Emmaus from Jerusalem. And Jesus shows up and starts talking with them about what all has happened in the last few days. And they don't recognize Jesus until they sit down at his table and break bread together. Okay, that's theologically significant. Eating with Jesus matters. Okay, in Acts, people are constantly eating together as the church. What do we read about the church in Acts? They gathered together to break bread. Okay? We also see the centrality of the communion feast in Acts as a way that we get to eat with Jesus now. Okay, several of the parables Jesus tells talk about eating and who is it that gets invited to the feast and who is it that gets left out. Right, we didn't cover this parable in our current series on the parables, but if we had, the middle of Luke chapter 14 is the parable of the great banquet. Okay, and in the parable of the great banquet, the host invites a lot of people, but they all make excuses. They can't come. So who is it that gets to eat at the banquet table? Well, it's the blind, it's the lame, it's the crippled that come in and get to eat at the banquet table. Okay, Jesus often says that those who get to party, those who get to eat with Jesus are not the ones we expected. All right, now we turn to Luke 15, and Jesus is addressing two separate crowds in Luke 15 at the exact same time. Okay, notice again verses 1 and 2 of Luke 15. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Okay, in response to this crowd, Jesus turns and tells three parables. Okay, the last of which is this parable of the prodigal son. Okay, so here's the scene, right? Jesus is sitting in the middle. Surrounding him are the sinners. Okay, those tax collectors, those people who aren't living a righteous life. Outside of them are the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. These are the righteous people. These are the people who do what's right. They are more righteous than everybody else. And I think it's extremely obvious who Jesus is targeting with these two characters in the story. There's the righteous one who gets left outside the party. And then there's the sinner who gets to eat at the banquet table. You know, I think Jesus would have probably made a terrible politician, right? Jesus knows how to offend people who are in power. But he's trying to teach us something that matters. Okay, so here's the question that I have as I read this parable. Here's what I want to know as I go to Luke 15. That is, how do I make sure that I'm not left outside of the party? Okay? How do I make sure that I'm not the older brother walking away from the banquet table? How do I make sure that I'm more like the younger brother who actually gets a seat at Jesus' table? How do we make sure we aren't left on the outside of the party? All right, I think the parable gives us the answer. I think fundamentally what Jesus is teaching to everybody in his audience is that we need to change our attitude about grace. Okay? We have to change our attitude about grace. Do you want a seat at Jesus' table? It starts and it stops with grace. All right, 3 thoughts for you as we apply this. Okay, number 1 is that grace is only offensive when I don't think I need it. Okay? Grace is only offensive when I don't think I need it. You know, I used to judge people who would put leashes on their kids. You ever seen that? Like at the airport or the grocery store or something, you see these parents walk around, they got their kid on a leash. Okay, I remember thinking, that's terrible to do to a child. Okay, that's not a dog, that's your kid. Don't put a leash on your kid. I judged those parents. Then, the very first time Rachel was going to take our 2 boys through the airport by herself, you know what's a great idea? We put 2 leashes on my 2 kids, right? I don't judge parents that put leashes on their kids anymore, okay? My experience has changed my perceptions, right? It's easy for me to look down on someone else if I'm not in their situation, right? It was easy for the older brother to resent the grace his younger brother received because he didn't think that he ever needed grace himself. He thought he was at the Father's table because he deserved to be there. It was only the younger son who was there because of grace. He didn't understand that the only reason he was also invited to eat at his father's table is because of the generosity and grace of his father. You know, the older brother may well have been the better child. In fact, undoubtedly, he was the more righteous child. But he was never good enough to deserve or earn his seat at the table. The only way you get a seat at the Father's table is because he loves you. If we can't see ourselves as sinners in need of grace, then we don't get any. You know, it doesn't matter how righteous we are. If we don't know that we desperately need grace, we will always be on the outside of the party. Okay, if we can't gather around and eat with prodigals, then we don't get to eat. Does that work? Grace is only offensive when I don't think I need it. All right, number 2. Along with this is the idea that Jesus' banquet table is really big. Okay? The banquet table of Jesus is really big. You know, one of the things that's happened fairly recently in our culture, they didn't do this when I was a kid, but I hear now they have a lot of baseball games where they don't even keep score. You've heard of this, right? We'll have like little league games for kids, and they don't keep score anymore because they don't want to create winners and losers, right? Everybody gets to win. And regardless of whether you won any games in your season or not, what do you get at the end of the season? Your trophy, right? You get to proudly put up at home and say, look, I'm a winner. We didn't win any games, but I'm a winner. Okay? I'm against that, just so you know. I think we need to teach kids winning and losing because when they become adults, there's winners and losers, right? Okay? Better to learn how to lose when you're a kid than to lose for the very first time when you're an adult and then you end up on my wife's therapy couch, right? We need to teach about winners and losers to little kids. All right. But then there's other sports that I like where there aren't any winners and losers. Okay, the way I like to go out and play golf, there is no winner and there is no loser. If you get to spend a day playing golf, you're a winner, right? And it doesn't matter how terribly Keith plays. He's still a winner, okay? It doesn't matter if you're like Mr. Palmer who can't keep track of his own score. He keeps forgetting strokes, okay? At the end of the day, you got to play golf. You're still a winner, right? You have a handicap. I'm not sure that's not the sermon we're addressing this morning, though. We'll have a sermon on honesty later, and this will come back up. Don't worry about it. Part of the problem the older brother had is he was only thinking in terms of winners and losers. He wasn't thinking in terms of playing a game where everybody could win. He was thinking about playing a game where the only way he won is if someone else lost. He thought that the only way to ensure his seat at the table was to make sure that nobody less righteous than he got a seat. That's the wrong way to think about grace. We need to realize that the banquet table of Jesus is really big. There's room for everybody who wants a seat at the table. There's room for everybody who wants to receive grace. And that just because somebody else who may be a worse sinner than I am gets a seat at the table doesn't mean that there's less there for me. Okay? We've got to quit thinking of grace in terms of winners and losers and think of it as the fountain free that's free for all. We sing that song. We really believe that. The banquet table of Jesus is really big. All right, number 3, finally, is that we join God as sons and daughters, not servants. Okay, we join God as his children, not as his servants. You know, the younger son longed to come home and just be a servant to his father. Maybe dad will accept me back if I come and bow down at his feet and just want to serve again. The older brother complains that his father wouldn't be fair, and yet he had served him for all these years. He says, "Father, I have slaved for you," is what the text says. Both sons misunderstood what the father really wanted. The father didn't want 2 slaves, he wanted 2 sons. The father wants more than anything to have a loving relationship with his children. What does it mean for you and I to accept the grace of God Almighty and come to him not as his servants but as his children, entering into a close relationship with God? Our Father has given us the most important gift ever, the ultimate gift, the gift of grace. Are we willing to accept it? Are we willing to sit around his table with all of the other imperfect people that have come to him and enjoy the grace that our Father gives us? At this time in our service, we're going to sing a few verses of an invitation song. During the singing of this song, we as the church would like to be here for you. If you don't know the grace of God, we would love to sit down with you, studying God's Word, what it looks like to truly accept his grace. If there's any sort of prayer request you have, anything we can help you with, please come forward while we stand and sing this song.